Good evening. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you to a BW Dialogue with two authors. They're professors, they're thought leaders. They're sought out for their advice, for their counsel by entrepreneurs, by large institutions and individuals. So let me welcome Mr. Tarun Khanna, Professor Tarun Khanna, who's very well known and preeminent, and really doesn't need an introduction to anyone who is on a quest of knowledge or who's building companies. But today we're not talking to him as a professor, we're talking to him as an author, though those two roles are never inseparable. Let me also welcome the co-author and co-panelist today, Professor Geoffrey Jones, who's again well-known and eminent, and they both have collaborated together to write a book that has made me think. And when the book came to me, I thought another book on leadership. And what will it? And it has big names associated, so it raised my expectations, but it fulfilled my expectations also. So let me welcome Professor Tarun Khanna and Professor Geoffrey James on a discussion about their latest book on leadership called Leadership to Last: How Great Leaders Leave Legacies Behind. To assist me in the conversation and to make it more interesting and diverse, I have my two editorial colleagues, Mr. Ruel Amin, who's a senior editor with BW Business World, and Ms. Vasudha Mukherjee, who's an editorial lead with BW Business World, to join in the conversation. Let me start by asking both Mr. Khanna and Mr. Jones about how did they utilize the last 22 months of the pandemic, personally and professionally. Let me start with Professor Khanna first, and then I'll bring in Professor James. Professor Khanna, welcome, and Professor James, welcome. Professor Khanna, how did you utilize your last 22 months, both personally and professionally?
Great question. Something we're thinking about all the time, mostly looking out my home office window. Sometimes at snow, sometimes at beautiful summer, spring weather in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Personally, helping the kids transition to college, which, as you may know, was very disrupted, particularly for those who were just arriving at college. And in the US, of course, everybody leaves and goes to all residential colleges for the most part. So that's been the personal preoccupation. And professionally, actually, we're privileged to be in a profession where you can manage without having to get your hands dirty in some ways. So we did actually quite well. We used it to rethink work. We produced this book, as a result of which we are in your August company now, and talking to your viewers. A lot of teaching and research. I'd like to say some really interesting pedagogical innovations, which I think will stand the test of time and continue to be part of the way we teach and engage with students, CEOs, financiers, executives, politicians from around the world. So it's been, a bittersweet time, so to speak, but we're navigating it along with the rest of the world.
Okay, Professor Jones, what about you? What did you do differently than Professor Khanna?
For me, it was a great opportunity to work. So I'd had this life where I was always traveling around the world, talking, pontificating, all of that. Suddenly that was gone. So I actually wrote two books. This book with Tarun and another book, and it was lovely. I couldn't have done it without the pandemic. And on a personal level, I have a very large garden, like over an acre of land, and I transformed that. I cleared out all the weeds. I made new paths. I made it like a outdoor study area. So I'm now talking to you from this like beautifully landscaped garden, thanks to the pandemic, because I never had time before to take any notice of it. So pandemic was a great opportunity for me. Yeah.
Fantastic. So you use your time optimally, if I may use that word, both on the professional front, academic front, and personally in terms of pursuing your hobbies. In your case, Professor Jones, you've tended to a large garden and made it absolutely fresh, if I may use that. And Professor Khanna, apart from writing books, doing your consulting work and, thinking about a lot of things which are undergoing change, because the post-pandemic world is different than the pre-pandemic world. And we'll come to that, but let's focus on the reason why we are here, which is the book Leadership to Last, what great leaders do to leave legacies behind. And first of all, when I first got the book and a mail about the book, I said, another book on leadership? Dude, we have like tons and tons of books on leadership. Why another book on leadership? So what's different in this book that somebody should read it?
Annurag, that was my reaction too. When we started thinking about, should we produce something like this? I think the simple answer is that it's not like we are, inventing great new concepts, but I think we're bringing very new data and experiences to the attention of the public, not just in India, but the book is based on original video interviews with iconic entrepreneurs in many, many developing countries around the world, produced over the last 10 plus years.
India.
There's a little bit less of China because of language. We're all over Africa, Middle East, Latin America, other countries in South Asia. These are people who very often will not speak to the public, but they are at the helm of extremely large enterprises that have lasted generations, hundreds of years sometimes, and have changed the very foundations of society. So these are not unicorns going public, as we say in India, fatafat, quickly, and making a quick buck. So it's a very different ethos. Right? How do you create things that
they've lasted over generations?
They've lasted generations.
Yeah. I don't only mean to interrupt, but at the start of the book, you do write that society tends to glorify the get-rich entrepreneur these days.
Yes.
And build a company and take it public and make money, and that gets glorified by media a lot. But these companies and these entrepreneurs have over generations stood the test of time and reinvented themselves, and the operations of the management of the farm has been passed on smoothly from one generation to another and reinvented. And I'll come to the specific, but I just wanted to buttress the point that you were making, that you do start with that in the book.
Yes, thank you. So I think that's the primary answer, Annurag, which is if we focus, and it's not like these people are financially any less successful than the get-rich-quick entrepreneur. It's just that they are focused on far more fundamental issues that, as I say, just change the direction of billions of people's lives. So we felt it was important to bring that. And we're lucky enough to be in an institution where people will talk to us because they trust us. And so that's what we're trying to do. And the underlying resource, which is what we really want people to know, is 150 original hours of video content straight from the horse's mouths that's completely public and free to anybody to use. So that's the intent. But I'll hand over to Jeff.
Professor Jones, your inputs on why somebody should pick the book and read when there are so many books on leadership.
It has to be said, a lot of the books on leadership are just kind of puff pieces. Person is like wonderful, everything is wonderful, everything they touch is successful, and everything else. As Tarun said, people trusted us when we talked to them. So we also have people talking in this book about mistakes. We have them talking about the difficulties of doing some things, the challenges. So it's much more, it's not a puff book in many ways. And while, your typical book on leadership will have some sort of glorified account of business successes, we identify a series of issues like inclusion, like challenging gender stereotypes, which I think you don't find in the average book on leadership. And I think we're quite proud of our willingness to be a little bit unconventional in what we approach.
Thank you so much. And I would say it is a book that once you start reading, and if you're serious about building an organization and learning from what organizations and entrepreneurs have got right over the years, because it's very conversational, it is based on real incidents. And there is a takeaway at the end of the chapter. So, what you're from an Indian entrepreneurs, you have Mr. Adi Godrej, you have Mr. Rahul Bajaj, you have Mr. Sanjay Lalbai, you have Mr. M.V. Sobaiya. So you're pretty much, looked at some of the iconic businesses, both in the West, I would say Ahmedabad, Mr. Lalbai, and South, Mr. Sobaiya. I would have believed you would have talked to a Munjals. It would have been nice, but they've taken a little different trajectory. But now let me ask you.
I should just say, Dr. Batra, that I'm very close to the Munjals. And the only reason they're not in there is that Brijmohanji was unwell. That's the only reason. And then sadly, as you know, he passed away. So,
I was thinking about it. So that's how I brought it up, because, I said, there are some two business families from Bombay and Pune, one from Ahmedabad, one from the South, and there's nobody from North, at least the Munjals. So that's why I mentioned what I mentioned. Now, let me also, when the leaders start, do they really think about legacies? That's a question I think, or when do, in their lifetime, because you work with entrepreneurs of all shapes, sizes, from various parts of the world, as I said, Middle East, to, Argentina, to China, to India, to Africa. So when do leaders start thinking about legacies? And my follow-up question is, is there a playbook to creating a legacy? Of course, every business is unique, geographic is unique. And as like when you talk to Mr. Godrej, you sum up that, the gist of it is that you got to create rules by which the family members should be governed in terms of their roles in the business. Like when you talk to Mr. Rahul Bajaj, you talked about, he says that not all family members have the abilities to be part of the family business or run it or run parts of it. So you need to make the distinction when you deal with family members. When you talk about Mr. Lalbai, you talk about empowering the next generation, right? And when you talk to Mr. Sobaiya, he talks about communication as the most important thing when it comes to keeping your family members posted on developments, involving them, and what is the right communication. So is there when it comes to managing families and creating legacies, because managing families is in some way equal to creating legacies, is there a playbook? And if yes, what is that? Professor Jones, you first this time, and then I'll get in Professor Khanna. Professor
in
Jones?
some ways, I think there isn't a play. I think if there was a playbook, it would almost be a sort of an artificial thing. If you started off in your 20s, you said, I'm going to create a legacy. I don't know. I don't know what I'd think about that. I'd probably think it wasn't genuine. And I think in our interviews, you often see people describing a process of learning. I'll give an example, not from India, but from a guy from Dubai, Fadi Gandor, who was a very important entrepreneur who's included in this book. And he talks openly about, I developed our business. He was working like crazy, trying to make money and everything. And then at some stage, he realized that his business had an impact on society.
Professor Khanna, if you can take over and
so I'll just pick up where Jeff got cut off. I think what he's saying, which I agree with, is that there isn't a recipe book, because that would be very unrealistic and frankly very trite and disingenuous. I think what there is a set of principles that you should be conscious of when you're thinking about building for the long run. That are a little bit different than the get-rich-quick entrepreneur, where the objective is to list your company and take it public very quickly. And we can talk a little bit about what those principles might be. But Annurag, you started by asking, do people think about legacy when they start? And I think my answer would be not really. They're really thinking about a problem that's really bothering them. So, one of my really good friends in East Africa, James Mwangi, is the biggest fintech entrepreneur in Africa now. And fintech is a hot area. But his starting point is watching his very poor mother, as a little boy, struggling with finding, ways to do basic transactions. Nowadays, with online platforms, and in India with Paytm and so many other, the United Payment Interface and so on, we take it for granted. But when James started, there was no solution for financial transactions for people. And that has become a gigantic empire. But the legacy part only kicked in, once there was a robust business. And I think that's fairly typical. You look at the Chettiar businesses in the South, right? They started with basic money lending in Burma, right? Nobody was thinking about a legacy. They were thinking about what's a productive enterprise. And then it went to land holding, and they had to adapt to, the collapse of the British Empire, being pushed out of Burma back to India, and so on and so forth. And along the way, people say, my goodness, we've got this big thing that's doing really good work and is very profitable. How do we think about leaving something for society? So I think it kicks in over time.
Thank you so much, Professor Jones. We couldn't get the full impact of what you were saying because you got cut off. You were at a point where you were saying that it's not possible. It would not be genuine to have a playbook. It is very unique, and then you got cut off.
Yes, I think Tarun picked it up just perfect. That's, as usual, he said what I would have said.
Fantastic. Now, let me ask you one more question that has come onto my mind. Post the pandemic, the world is a different place, right? Of course, the human rules, values don't change, but behaviors do get impacted. They may be short-term behaviors compelled by a need to act in a certain way because of the environment, and some of it may become habits. They may be more long-term behaviors. What has been the impact of pandemic on leadership styles? And what is here to stay permanently? And what is more immediate temporary reaction, which as the pandemic goes away, will change? What has changed in the leadership styles or need to change in leadership styles of these large company promoters, family-run businesses?
So I think you touched upon it in the phrasing of your last 2-3 questions, that the communication styles have changed a great deal. Because all of us are struggling with work from home, work from anywhere, hybrid work, on again, off again, lockdown, no lockdown. And I think leaders and managers have had to adapt a great deal to that, just like people working in organizations have had to adapt. How much of this remains permanent? There are lots of surveys out there across the world suggesting that a hybrid model is here to stay with varying degrees. But I think, Annurag, I would say it's still a process of societal experimentation. You have entrepreneurs experimenting in different parts of the world, and it remains to be seen which parts of these are permanent, which are not. But as I alluded to in my response to your first question, taking a personal example, a lot of the online learning that we were doing, hybrid learning, I think is here to stay, because we've been able to reach, thousands of people simultaneously on Zoom, literally thousands of people on Zoom at one shot, and come up with techniques. So that will stay. So we will see. So that's my first. I think one of the things that is definitely front and center on the minds of every entrepreneur worth his or her salt these days, whether in India or elsewhere, is a glaring focus on inequality, right? In every single society. In the US is practically convulsed with this. You see the political turmoil here. My view is that it's a response to, the pandemic shining a light on something we already knew, that inequality had gone up, and the poorest segment of society, the less educated, were uniquely ill-equipped to deal with the pandemic. Whereas those of us who were lucky enough to have large gardens, like Jeff and me, and were knowledge-intensive individuals, we were much less affected by it. And I think the same is true in India. And I think an entrepreneur who doesn't pay attention to that is both risking his or her legacy and also not capitalizing on a huge opportunity to do amazing amounts of good and make a buck, actually, while solving a problem. So that, I think, is permanent, that attention.
And do you see I'm asking this question directly to you, Professor Jones, so do you see a FOMO on digital amongst traditional businesses and traditional businessmen, if at all there is any distinction between what is traditional and what is new age? Is there a FOMO? For example, let me give you a context. The Tatas, which is really a very, very old business institution in India, in the last 1 year has been snapping up digital businesses, right? So clearly there is a FOMO. Mr. Ambani has invested in Kalari so that he can invest in startups, because some people may or may not appreciate the culture of Reliance. Some may appreciate it. It works for them. But, it's not about Reliance. They want to work with PE and VC rather than corporates. So do you see that, Professor Jones, the traditional entrepreneurs, the business owners have been able to, in some way, move the needle on digital, which possibly they were not doing pre-pandemic?
I mean, what the pandemic's done is raise the profile and the importance of digital business. So even people sort of vaguely knew it was important before. Now it's in your face. So I think it's become a very interesting, but much more interesting opportunity. Is that the only thing they're pursuing? No, I mean, the Tata, you mentioned the Tatas, right? And they've just acquired Air India, which is the opposite of a digital business. So I'm not sure that there's like a universal trend, but Tarun is the expert on things digital, so I'll let him answer that.
So the only thing I'd add to what Jeff is saying is that I think there is a fear of missing out, FOMO, as you're saying, Annurag. But what's really interesting is to what extent are the quote unquote traditional businesses, to what extent are they able to acquire the intellectual and organizational muscle to deal with these newfangled things? And that, I think, is an open question. I mean, a number of the companies that we've talked about are, I don't know any forward-looking entrepreneur, and everybody in this book is almost by definition a forward-looking entrepreneur, who's not grappling with digital. But I think there's varying degrees of success in being able to get the rank and file of the organization moving in that direction. That's a very difficult proposition. And it's not unique to India. It's true across the developing world. It's true even in the US. So that adjustment process is a wait and see and a continuous work in progress. But again, I think it's the best way to do this, in my limited experience, is to really enjoy it, to treat it as an opportunity and embrace it, because then it's less like an albatross around your neck and pulling you down, and it's more of a real opportunity, and bring your workforce along with you. It can be a lot of fun if it's done right.
While I hand it over to Ruhail and Vasudha, I enjoyed reading the book, but one question that I would like, which is not answered directly in the book, it came to my mind, is this question of fathers giving control to their sons. And in my 25 years of entrepreneurship and 8 years of business world, and dealing with some of the business owners or similar kind of business owners you talk, it's very difficult for them to hand over the reins to their sons fully. I want to use the word fully. Okay. What do you think has changed in the last few years? Has anything changed? Has nothing changed? What needs to change? I want you to get a perspective from both of you on that. First you, Professor Khanna, and then Professor Jones.
So I would say nothing's changed.
I like the fact that you guys are very straight talking and really, really direct about it.
Kuch nahi badla. Nothing has changed. It's the same as ever, right? I mean, it's a human thing. People are like doing something, they're very successful, and they think, okay, I'm going to give it to my son or my daughter. There are lots of handoffs to daughters, by the way. It's not just sons. Right? I'm going to give it to the next generation. Adi is handed over to Nisa. Nisa was my student at Harvard many years ago and has done it very nicely and cleanly. Subaya did it in his time very nicely and cleanly. The Ayalas have done it brilliantly in the Philippines for 5 generations now. So there are ways of doing it. But there's a human reluctance, to say that, okay, I'm done and let me go to my next chapter of my life. So I don't think that's changed, Anurag, in all candor. It's just something that takes a lot of work and a lot of attention to the governance and recognition of the emotion of the person handing over and the person taking over. On both sides, there has to be some, what would I call it, emotional intelligence to handle it.
Okay, Professor Jones.
Yeah, I mean, human nature is notoriously slow to change. So there's this, it's, I'm a business historian, so I've seen this sort of thing over 200 years, these sort of family tensions. The only, I mean, there's this only slight changes. There's like an army of consultants and business school academics who now have like courses and training about what to do. It doesn't mean that people will follow the rules, but at least there's a body of people able to give some advice. And if you want to listen to that advice, maybe you can handle things a little bit better, I think. I think that's been the change over the last 2 decades, but yeah. Otherwise, the problem, I think, remains with us.
Okay, my last question before I bring in Roel and Vasudha. Professor Khanna and Professor Jones, based on the contents in the book, what, if you are to, I'm saying there's no playbook, I agree with you, because the journey of each of the business house and the entrepreneur are unique. There may be some similarity in what they deal with, but by and large, the nature of businesses is unique. Issues are unique, family structures are unique, traditional historic family structures are unique. But if you had to give 2-3 suggestions which are of generic nature, which can be used to build businesses where legacies can be built, where leadership creates legacies, what would be those? First you, Professor Jones, and then I'll come to Professor Khanna.
I think you need to act consistently with integrity, not sort of make exceptions here or make exceptions there, but have a culture, a set of values that you always act with integrity consistently. And I think that's a really, really good start to building a legacy you can be proud of.
Okay, one is consistently showing integrity. As one of my favorite authors, Stephen Covey would say, doing the right thing for the right reason in the right manner. We grew up reading him. And second is, if I take it from your book, is, being able to assess the capabilities of him. One thing that runs across all the Indian interviews and is this assessing the capabilities of your family members, of successors. But the only qualitative comment I have there is sometimes ability is a function of opportunity. If you give somebody a company to run at some stage, unless until they're really bad and they have no supervision, they have no kind of structures within the approach, they will learn how to be close to perfect and deliver performance. So the only thing is the opportunities, to be able to run smaller businesses and scale. I would second would be progressive creation of opportunities to run smaller businesses, which has happened in some of the case studies that you talked about. And third, I would say another is sometimes giving them a fresh start in a fresh business. I would add that, in my own understanding, or in a business editorial product, I am not a professor or a historian, but my understanding, if they can make sometimes a success of something fresh, it gives confidence to be able to entrust them with existing larger enterprises. So that would be mine. Professor Khanna, yours?
So Anurag, I like your 2 suggestions. I think they ring true to me. I mean, look at the history of the Lalbhai group. If you look at Sanjay Lalbhai's early years, that's exactly how it was, with the previous generation giving all the siblings and so on different little places to experiment and learn. That's absolutely right. I would add to Jeff's principle of integrity one more, which is realizing that particularly in the emerging markets like India, a lot of the things that you'd like to assume the government has done, very likely the government has not done. I'm talking about broad public goods. You'd like there to be a skilled workforce, and you'd like there to be amazing public health, as we have in many countries in the world. But most developing countries are developing exactly as the word suggests. So these goods have not come into play. And the onus falls on the entrepreneur to take care of that. You may say it's not my business. My business is run my business. That's great, but that's a theoretical concept, right? When the infrastructure around you is missing, particularly the soft infrastructure, you have to factor that into your thinking about particularly the longevity of your business plan, right? You see this in South Africa, when the HIV pandemic was running amok, large corporations had to basically become functioning healthcare entities, not because they wanted to. I mean, they may be a mining company, but they had to become a healthcare company to make sure that some worker was alive to show up and do the mining. So sometimes, these problems are choosing, and the good entrepreneurs take it in their stride and say, okay, let's see how we can do it judiciously. Not to get in the way of the government, but to help along the state, because at the end of the day, the government is us. It's the function of the people. It's not a different thing. So that would be my second principle. So first is integrity, and the second is not being shy about taking on societal issues that would anyway get in the way of your business.
Thank you so much. At this point, I can go on talking to Professor Khanna, you and Professor Jones. I hope I get an opportunity to do a longer conversation and hopefully face-to-face, either in India. We have a business lit fest, so hopefully when the pandemic is over, we can invite on one of your trips. Hopefully there is synchronicity and we can get you to be at the festival. But till then, I recommend all entrepreneurs, business people, people who have family businesses to read this book. I'm sure it will give you something to think about and something to implement. Over to you, Rohel and Vasudha. Rohel, first you, and then you, Vasudha.
Thank you, Dr. Batra. It was a wonderful conversation, Professor Jones and Professor Khanna. And I was just doing some maths that it was uneven, 3 hosts and 2 speakers, now 2 and 2 speakers. It's a level playing field. My quick question is, so you mentioned in the book that the idea behind was to capture the memories of men and women who built transformational organizations across Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East. So it's a huge canvas. How do you filter out the big leaders? It must be a challenging task. I really wanted to know this bit. If one of Mr. Khanna, you can start with. Was it challenging to capture this huge, enormous size of leadership into this one book? And how did you make that happen?
So Rohil, thank you for that question. In some ways, so first thing I would say, it sounds extraordinary, but it's true. I don't think we were turned down by anybody anywhere in the world ever.
The Harvard mark, of course, who would say no to it? Is that also?
Yeah, it has nothing to do with Jeff and me. It's the Harvard reputation. So let's be clear. But, it's a real privilege to be at an institution like this, where people will, and these are, legacy businesses. So they're not particularly standing there and inviting the press in. And I feel that both Jeff and I felt that we have a responsibility to bring these stories out to the attention of, so, why should people, let's say in our classroom in Boston, why should they only be learning about, Bill Gates and Bill Ford and Andrew Carnegie and David Rockefeller, as iconic as they were, because there were people with comparable vision and implementation and legacy in many parts of the world. And we had the reach and the connections to be able to at least ask whether these individuals would be profiled. Now, sometimes we couldn't get the interview because of logistics or illness or so on. That's a different story. But at least we had no barrier to acceptance once they were reassured by what we were doing. And I would like to emphasize that everything here is completely free to the public. Anybody can go on our website and access it. And the point of the book is to be a window into this amazing resource that I think will stand the test of Maybe that'll be our small legacy, or one of our small legacies ourselves. The second sort of transactional response to your question is, yes, of course, deciding what to put in and not put in is an editorial task, which you're familiar with as editors in a magazine. The primary function is not to profile one person and not profile another. It's to get a set of key ideas across in a way that, to the best of the abilities of our creative abilities, would tell simple stories that are accessible, and again be an entree into a much broader tapestry of stories. And we focused on India, South Asia, because a good third of the interviews in our database are of entrepreneurs in South Asia, primarily India, but other parts of South Asia also. So that's really the focus of this one. And we will do another one for Latin America, one for Africa over time.
Right. Professor Jones?
I would only emphasize that I think it was very, very important that this was a public goods project, because when we went to somebody, we could say, you're not just helping Harvard acquire a body of knowledge. You're, in a way, by talking about your own history, giving back to your own country. Because, in many cases, there's not hardly anything known about how business sectors developed. Or if there is anything known, it's the story that these guys are bad guys. So I think there was a real, people felt they were giving back a little bit and helping the collective learning of their societies. And I think that was very important. And when we approach somebody, we always made that very, very clear. This is not the Tarun and Geoff show. You're giving something that will become a permanent legacy, and anybody in your country or in the world will be able to access it.
Absolutely. Vasudha.
Thank you so much, Rohil. And actually, I had such a good time listening to your conversation with Dr. Batra. For a moment, I forgot that I was supposed to be an interviewer, not just an audience member here. And I know you have already kind of mentioned this, that, there is no playbook. But I did want to kind of hone in on the fact that, you are talking about so many skills that good leaders have, that lasting legacies seem to have. And a lot of that is surrounding, having integrity, having value systems. And, right now, there's a lot of conversation, at least in India, I'm sure worldwide too, about skilling and reskilling and upskilling people. And there has been a lot of discussion about, instilling values. And generally, this has been coming down on education institutes. Like, it's become their duty in management institutes to instill these values in their students before they even go out and start working. As educators and people who have done so much research and spoken to so many people, what is your take on this? I'm just curious to know. Anyone can answer. I don't want to hone in on one person or the other.
Personally, it's my personal view. I think it's very hard to teach values. And I think if I look at our MBA students in their late 20s, I think it's practically mission impossible to teach values. I think values are formed at an earlier stage in people's lives. So I think if we want a next generation of people who think collectively and think seriously about the society and the environment, we need to think hard about education, much younger education, people in the, K-12 education. I think there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done in that space, really. I think all we could hope to do in business school, for example, is show people stories, good stories and bad stories, and hope that something lasts. And that's part of the story of creating emerging markets, is that we're creating material that people can see stories anyway that maybe will influence them. But changing values, I think, is is difficult after a certain age. Maybe you're more optimistic, Tarun.
So Vasudha, I'll also address your direct question whether it should fall only on business schools, but on Jeff's value point, about 10, 15 years ago, we had a series of crises in the US markets. And, a significant portion of leading business leaders in America graduate from our school. We're lucky that way. And of course, some of these scandals were traced back to people who had attended Harvard Business School. So that prompted a lot of reflection on the part of the faculty. I remember it went on for some years. And the point of view that you heard Jeff express was, of course, a point of view that's held by a lot of faculty. But you also had a spectrum of views saying that it's not entirely hopeless, that we should be raising. So we have a required course in the MBA program, which we didn't have when I was going through the MBA program, 30 years ago, which is called Leadership and Corporate Accountability. Now, it's debatable how much effect it has, but I think you'll find a spectrum of views on that. So I'll let you process that point of view as best as you wish. I certainly think that not everybody would be as pessimistic as the view that Jeff expressed. Of course, it helps to have values earlier on, but given if some people don't have that, or they've come from circumstances where that's not happened, then I don't know that it's useless to expose them to better ways of living. On the question that you asked, Vasudha, no, I don't think there's any way that only management institutes can do this. Right? It has to be a societal lift. It has to be, and I agree with Jeff very strongly that it's, the primary focus has to come from walking the talk. Right? That you talk about honesty and integrity, but actually doing it. You see some amazing stories in our book. You see Kiran Mazumdar in biotech. You see Anuaga in Thermax Industries. You see Naina Kidwai. Actually, interestingly, I just took 3 women's names, but there are lots of honest men also in the book. Jerry Rao talks a lot about dealing with things of corruption. Abed Bhai in Bangladesh, Ayala's in Philippines. They're all walking the talk. So I think that's a big thing. And of course, walking the talk is something that the politicians need to do, the average citizen needs to do, and not cut corners wherever possible. So I think it's a societal lift. And coming back to at least our institution here, Harvard Business School, one of the things that I think I'm most proud of this institution is that we work very closely with practice. We have our set of mathematicians and computer scientists and philosophers and so on, and I'm myself an applied math person. But being academic and theoretical shouldn't get in the way of working with practice and working with companies and scientists and activists. And so if you walk on our campus every day, you'll see dozens of these people floating around. And it's a real opportunity. And we don't see that in the Indian universities, right? I'm working a lot with different parts of the Indian government to try to get this ethos in, but it's a generational effort. So I think it'll be a societal lift in some sense. It's not going to be done just by the top management institutes. Not possible.
No, of course, and I can also imagine that in the kind of scandals you're talking about, writing Harvard business graduate is far more shocking than saying, oh, so and so went to this kind of school.
The press would love it. Yeah. It sells magazines, right? I mean,
absolutely, yes. So. It's the first thing you read. You see Stanford student, or this is definitely. But it's not fair to put that kind of responsibility on higher education institutes. But that being said, I think Mr. Jones was right that having these kinds of stories and kind of showing the long-term effects that these values can have on your businesses in an age of startups can go a long way, and we hope that can start the right kind of conversation. Ruhail, back to you.
Yeah. So my question, this one is a little different. Writing a book, such a huge project that you have undertaken, and you said it's not Tarun and Geoffrey's show. Of course not. But tell me the back story of writing this book. 2 authors, 2 different sensibilities coming together, agreeing, disagreeing. Was it simple? As simple as it appears, so seamless right now on screen. What was the backstory like?
The backstory is that I always defer to Jeff.
I always
and then it
defer to
works.
Tarun. So.
No, but seriously, I think you put your finger on it, right? We're like chalk and cheese. We're about two people as different as possible as you could imagine. And I think that's what makes it a good partnership. I mean, Jeff is a consummate historian, very, very thorough, very much in the archives. That's not my skill set. Yeah, my skill set is, if there is one, is twofold. It's to be an abstract thinker. I'm trained in mathematics, basically, and then to be an entrepreneur. I love the rough and tumble of building organizations in developing countries. I love it. I think it's every bit as creative, more creative than writing a book. So I don't see this writing a book, Ruhail, as being any different than building a company in Bangalore. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of creativity. It takes a lot of iteration, and it takes a lot of, speaking selfishly, surrounding yourself with people who have different skill sets and who are hopefully smarter than you.
There were a moment where you guys had to really argue about certain things and get things like, be on the same page.
No, I think we respect each other's judgment. So if Tarun said, this is that, then I would generally just follow. I mean, I think our relationship is complementary, which is, I think, is what you need. Different skills, but not wanting to fight. We published our first article together in 2006, an article about history matters. It's worth looking at the past. So we have also a track record of collaboration, which was important, I think, because we already knew each other's strengths and weaknesses.
The book. Absolutely. Vasudha.
Yeah. It's interesting because in the beginning of when we first started with Dr. Batra, I think Mr. Jones actually mentioned that one of the differences here is this is not really a fluff piece. And we do have a lot of these kinds of book in the market, right? The memoirs, the autobiographies, the 5 a.m. club, as if having the right routine will make you a successful businessman or entrepreneur. And this book is obviously more different than that. And I think the corruption element, the inclusivity, talking about these matters without necessarily in a bleak tone, like a lot of times read about it and it seems almost like there's no solution out. From an interviewer's perspective, how did you manage to kind of create those kinds of conversations where you were able to have these answers that were so honest and raw, but also not at the same time too, disheartening and hopeless?
I mean, I'll speak personally. I'm a glass half full kind of person by nature. So everything, even the tough things, are an opportunity. So for me anyway, I mean, the thing I most liked, also going back to Ruhail's question about writing the book, was actually not so much the writing, but doing the interviews, right? Because what's not to like about that, right? You're meeting interesting people around the world. All the interviews, I mean, almost all the interviews, well, actually all the interviews in the book were done in person. And so you're meeting interesting people and you're having a conversation, and there is this underlying element of trust, Vasudha. And so therefore people are telling you, and as Jeff was saying earlier, they're telling you all kinds of mistakes that they did. God, I wish I had done that, 20 years ago. It would have been a totally different experience, or so-and-so wouldn't have had that, something. And it's in the book, we're talking about it. So one nice thing about, of course, we can always criticize the design of the book. Hindsight is 20/20, etc., and all those would be true. But one nice thing about talking to people who are reflecting on the arc of their careers is that they don't have any pretense. They don't have any axe to grind. They're in a mood to give back, and we are, tapping into that and free writing, and hopefully being the conduits for very rich repositories of human experience. To bring it to, for all of us to reflect on. So it wasn't actually, once you start doing the interview, it's actually a lot of fun. I don't think anybody thought of it as, oh my God, the sky is falling, there's inequality, women are not being treated right, or there's, casteism, or whatever. They just said, okay, this is what we did. It's a real issue. We can solve it. Let's work together, roll up your sleeves. That's the nature of entrepreneurs, right? We kind of want to do something about a problem and try it and not be worried about tripping on our shoelaces, which we all do routinely. So.
Right.
No,
Yeah, I think
thank you.
building trust in the case. I think you mentioned Jerry Rao talking about corruption. In that case, I've known him for some years. He's come to my class not to talk about other things, and so he kind of knows where I'm coming from, and I'm not out to trick him or anything else. In other cases, some of the people I interviewed, I'd only just met, but I tried to spend like half an hour before just talking with them, and hopefully building a kind of a relationship of trust. And that's, I think, what you need, because people might think we're trying to trick them, expose them, or something else. And I think just expressing our genuineness was like very, very, very important, I think.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to quickly also add to that. Do you think the fact that because you're interviewing people who already have these, big companies sort of set up, that they're already kind of past this whole fearing about the responses kind of having a negative effect on them? Do you think that kind of helped with the whole, discussing these kind of things so openly?
Probably. I mean, we, by design, we were interviewing people like 60 plus who had their reputations, who had their experience there. It was out there. That definitely helped. And I think, and we were interviewing people who'd done many good things in their life without skeletons in the cupboard. So I think that gave them a willingness to talk and to give back, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's also good to hear from these people, because I think a lot of times people assume that if you are the successful, you're generally part of the problem. But it's when you read this stuff and you see these people constantly combating this, it's refreshing. It is a positive book. I thought it was a very positive book to read, and it was really interesting to go through those interviews and those direct responses. Again, that interview style. So glad you published it that way. It was great, nice to hear it, like you said, from the horse's mouth. Ruhail, your final question.
My final question. We have 6 minutes, so I am turning into this Indian anchor style, giving like 2 minutes for answers, so that Vasudha can ask her final question to you, Mr. Khanna. So in this age, I take an example of India, for example, every 1.3 billion plus, and everyone is a founder or a co-founder now. Everybody is getting into leadership. There's no public. Everybody's a leader. Have we got the wrong perception of leadership now as we go on Instagram, social media, all over? What is wrong with the way people think about leadership in your view? Overall, I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, if everybody wants to start by thinking they're a leader, more power to them. They should imbibe the good principles of what they think it means to be a leader, and try to use that to improve their way of, existing. And then maybe once in a while, just to be real, look over your shoulder and see if anybody's following you. And that'll clarify things for you. That's my response.
Right. Mr. Jones?
I think a world of leaders is better than a world of followers, actually.
Right. Perfect.
Yeah, I'm happy with it.
Absolutely. Vasudha, your final question.
My final question is one that I like to end all book interviews on, because we are here to talk about a book. I want to ask you both, what is your favorite book, or what are you reading right now?
Yeah. A couple of books that come to mind that I really like. One you'll have heard of and one you wouldn't have heard of. The one that you would have heard of is The Story of My Experiments with Truth by Mahatma Gandhi, autobiography. It's full of weaknesses, by the way. That's what I like about it. It says, this is the things I'm terrible at. So I really like the candor. Another book that you wouldn't have heard of was written in French, the English translation, which I really liked in the French, but the English translation is The Immobile Empire by Alain Périfitte. It's about the clash between the British Empire at the time. So this is Jeff's territory, but this is me being an amateur historian. The clash between the British envoy coming to Qing Dynasty China, and how very different worldviews clashed, and the same circumstances were interpreted completely differently by different people. It's a beautiful book. What am I reading right now? I'm reading some novels by Adichie, the Nigerian woman writer, Chinamanda Adichie.
Yes, yes.
His most famous book is Half of a Yellow Sun in the Biafran War in Nigeria. And if you look behind me, there's like hundreds of books that are there that are meant to be read but haven't been read yet. So.
Both of you, in fact, which is why I needed to ask.
That's my answer.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Jones, your favorite books and what are you reading right now?
Well, this is one of my favorite.
Good answer, Jeff.
I just
Great
can't put
answer.
it down. It's just ridiculous. As a historian, I read books all the time. So for pleasure, I watch movies.
Yeah.
And because I do history for pleasure, I watch science fiction movies.
I think we know where this is going.
Based in the future, because I've kind of done the past. So that's my answer. I'm afraid every evening can be watched somewhere in the future on some alien planet.
Oh, fair enough. That's a great answer, and I think I like asking these questions. Good, so nice to see the people who were reading what they're doing in their spare times. But thank you so much for joining us today on our platform and answering all our questions and getting into this deep dive discussion. And like your interviewees, you were also so open with us and honest with us. And thank you, Geoffrey, for coming on at this time. It's early for you, so have a great rest of the day. But the rest of us will be, I think, we'll be ending our days now.